What is up, guys? 70 Savage here. Today we have a very exciting video. We are going to be going over how to crank 90s in Fortnite. So after all these years, cranking 90s is still the fastest way to gain elevation in Fortnite. Therefore, it is an essential tool to have in your tool bag during build fights. When I was learning how to crank 90s, I did the same thing. I went straight to YouTube, I typed in how to crank 90s, and I actually ran out of videos to watch. So I thought I'd put one more out there. So before we get into it, if you are new to the channel, we are all about getting better at Fortnite to try and teach you how to be just as good as the pros. If you're interested in that type of content, definitely don't hesitate to slap that subscribe button below. And if you do like this video, slap that like button below. Let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so in order to get good at cranking 90s, you are going to need a place to practice. My favorite place and the best creative map that I have found to practice cranking 90s is no other than the Crank Simulator Infinity. Let's go ahead and load it up. So once you load up the Crank Simulator, all you gotta do is press start. And then once you're in, you run out from the little underground place that you start in. The part that we're interested in is the starting point here. So the 90s that we are going to be teaching in this video are called simple 90s. The way that they work is just like this. There's no extra protected wall on the side. There's no extra complications. These are the simplest possible 90s that you can crank, which also means they are the potential fastest possible 90s that you could crank. Another side note is that they're the most mat efficient 90s that you can crank. My favorite part about these 90s is they're very adaptable. So if you learn these 90s, the simple 90s, you can adapt them to any other type, whether they be protected 90s, wall 90s. The simple 90s are the best fundamental 90s to master. All right, guys, so we have broken down this tutorial into 5 very simple steps. They start with the absolute basics of the basics, and they move up into the advanced techniques that are going to allow you to crank the most optimal 90s. Step number 1, you want to understand what the piece placement for simple 90s looks like. This consists of one ramp, which you run to the top left corner of, 2 walls, a floor, and a ramp. Let's do that a little bit slower. 2 walls, a floor, and a ramp. Now that you understand the piece placement sequence, we are going to go into step number 2. That is actually leveraging the piece placement sequence of how to crank these simple 90s and combining it with your own practice. You need to be able to actually execute this consistently, place the pieces, and land on your upper ramp. You are going to be very slow at first, and I emphasize that it's much more important to be consistent. It's much more important to always land on this upper ramp without Harry Pottering yourself under your stair or landing underneath a floor than it is to go fast at this point. You want to be consistent. You want to always be landing on the upper ramp, and you want to be working your way up to that top left corner every single time. That brings us straight into step number 3. Once you are consistently landing on your ramp and you are not messing up the basics of this simple 90, you want to start focusing on going a little bit faster. You really want to start focusing on carrying your momentum into the next jump. You want to leverage the phasing through your floor and through the ramp to push you up to that next ramp, and you'll start to see the momentum become smoother and smoother to where you're constantly moving forwards. To be honest, for this step right here, it really just takes practice. Alrighty, so on to step number 4. Once you have mastered constantly carrying your momentum so that you can crank 90s while constantly moving forward, you want to focus on jumping as high as possible onto your next ramp every time you place it. This is going to allow you to gain the most elevation possible for each individual 90, resulting in an overall maximum upward velocity. There is nothing that's going to simply magically convert you from going to step 3 of carrying your momentum into step 4 of jumping as high as possible onto your next ramp. You just have to practice. That brings us to our final step, step 5, which is how to crank infinite 90s. You might notice as you start practicing this that you're getting jump fatigue on every 4th 90. So let's go ahead and figure out how to mitigate that. In order to prevent getting jump fatigue, you want to crank 3 90s out, and then you want to crank 1 jumpless 90. A jumpless 90 is the exact same thing as a regular simple 90. The only difference obviously being that you don't jump at all. You could practice the jumpless 90s on their own by not doing any jumping 90s in between. The way to do that is you want to just stay a little bit higher and a little bit more to the left on your ramp while you're cranking than you would if you were doing the regular simple 90s with a jump. Once you've mastered the jumpless 90, You can combine it with regular 90s so that you can crank very fast, infinite 90s with jump fatigue in game. So between those 5 steps, that is literally all that you need to be able to do to crank 90s just like the pros. The only other thing that you need to take into consideration is being able to crank 90s in both directions. You want to be able to go to the left and to the right. You want to be able to go infinitely to the left and to the right, which is going to make it very versatile in game. I recommend practicing your left 90s and your right 90s while you're learning and not waiting till the very end before you start cranking left 90s. There are slight nuances to working on each direction of cranking 90s, both left and right, that will help you with the opposite direction as well. All right guys, so that sums it up for the 5 steps that you are going to need in order to learn how to crank 90s. The key to getting good at 90s, I want to emphasize this, is practice, practice, practice. But I guarantee you, if you practice this for 15 minutes a day, in a matter of 2 weeks, you are going to be blown away as to the difference between how well you can crank 90s. You just gotta put in the work. So to be honest, I'm pretty hesitant to give this demo because I could just imagine all the comments coming in about all of the people who obviously can crank better 90s than I can. And if you can crank better 90s than me, that is fantastic. You should leave a comment in the description below that has additional information on how you learn to crank 90s so that people watching this video can learn from you as well. That being said, I have been practicing 90s about 15 minutes a day for a month now, so if you do the same thing, you can expect to be about just as good as this. So that's all for this video. I really hope that this made at least one of you better at Fortnite. If you made it this far in the video, I would really appreciate if you hit that like button below. If you are not yet a subscriber to the channel, definitely slap that subscribe button below. I'm going to continue to pump out content for how you can get better at playing Fortnite. Thank you guys so much for watching the video, and I will see you guys next time.